On this week's Lazy Sunday upload is probably my favourite conservative intellectual, Thomas Sowell. Now, this particular clip is taken from Sowell's appearance on William F. Buckley Jr.'s Firing Line in 1981. The reason I chose this clip is because Sowell makes the same arguments on issues such as the wage gap and racial discrimination that those of us that believe in facts and evidence make today. And that's what makes it both simultaneously amusing and demoralising, because the basic common sense evidence-based arguments Sowell was making almost 40 years ago are still being ignored today in favour of emotions and feelings. Now, the original clip is an hour long, so there's plenty of material for another video, or you could just watch the original. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to put together highlights for another video from the full program. Enjoy.
Oh, what would be the legitimate and what would be the illegitimate deductions that an observer might make from the fact that America is, roughly speaking, 50% women, feminine, and yet there's only a single woman senator in Congress? What would be a legitimate, what would be an illegitimate deduction to make from that?
Well, as I look at numbers
Paradox.
from various places around the world, I don't find anything faintly resembling an even representation of people in any institution anywhere in the world, broken down in any way. There's been a recent study of military forces around the world in which they can find no country in which the military force represents even approximately the ethnic composition of the society. Sometimes the poorer groups are overrepresented, sometimes underrepresented. There are all kinds of factors there. Well, what's amazing to me is that this notion that people would be evenly represented except for these institutional policies, that notion has had such momentum behind it without a speck of evidence being asked or presented.
Well, what about, so let's say you find 11% of a country is Indian, but only 1% vote, but 50% is white and 40% vote. Do you draw any deductions from that disparity?
I find that some people have different views on the importance of voting. But I find that throughout the world. If you look at Malaysia, for example, the Chinese are the large minority there, about a third or more of the Malaysian population. They're evenly represented in the colleges. The Chinese are outnumbered 3-1 by the Malays in liberal arts. They outnumber the Malays 8-1 in science and 15-1 in engineering. If you look at Asians in the United States who get PhDs, and here we're talking about a select group, you find that they're outnumbered about 3-1 by Hispanics who get PhDs in history, but they outnumber the Hispanics 10-1 in chemistry. That nowhere do I find this even spread of people that you look for. And I think the reason is very simple, that human beings are not random events.
Well,
that we all have histories, and there are values that come out of those histories, and we have things that we want to do and things that we don't want to do.
Well, are these genetic implications or purely cultural implications?
I would think cultural. I know myself when I was struggling in late teens, looking for work, it never occurred to me to become a policeman. It never occurred to me to become a policeman. There are other people, I'm sure, who would have occurred to immediately. I never thought of that. That was not something that I did. And I knew there were black policemen. I delivered groceries to one, so I knew that there were jobs there. It just was not something that I was led toward.
Well, I think it's one thing for us all to accept individual inclinations, but to accept group inclinations is, or should be, a little bit more difficult, shouldn't it? For you to say, I, Tom Sowell, was not interested in being a policeman is very different from saying blacks on the whole are uninterested in being
It's tougher to demonstrate in the case of a group. But what I'm saying is the contrary thesis, namely that all groups would be evenly represented everywhere if allowed to follow their own bent without any institutional barriers. That is what I find amazing, because even if you look at activities totally within their own control, what television programs to watch and so on, there's a whole sub-industry of studying the demographic composition of television audiences, simply because they found that the people, who watch NFL Monday Night Football are not the same people who watch Meet the Press or McNeil Lehrer. And the advertisers want to know who are those people, because they don't want to be selling lingerie to the people who are watching Monday Night Football, and they don't want to waste their product dollar, their advertising dollar. And they find there are very substantial differences, even in things that are totally within the control of the individual.
I'm leading back now to the question of why is there a single woman in the Senate, although half of Americans are women, and I guess I'm asking you whether this is a transcription of implicit anti-feminine values in this society.
Well, in a country where I think just over half the people are women, that if they wanted to fill the Senate with women, they could very well do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it may very well be that they take on the prejudices of men.
All sorts of things are possible. It's also possible that there are other reasons why women don't choose to get into positions like politics, because they have a set of demands which are very tough for most women to meet, and at the same time do the other things that most women do, such as raise children and so on.
So you would dismiss as as thoughtless any complaint against a society that had only one woman in the Senate, or only 11% blacks in Congress, or only 6% Jews, or whatever?
I wouldn't dismiss it. I would simply say, if there is evidence that you have, let us see that evidence. What I think is really tragic is that assertions have been made not only without evidence being offered, but without anyone even asking for evidence. It's as if these are self-evident truths that have been brought down from the mountainside.
So the thing to do is to look for non-invidious explanations.
No, the thing to do is look for whatever seems to be the most reasonable explanation in the circumstance. And I'm saying that the people who made the case the other way, or who've acted as if they made the case, typically have not felt the necessity even to bring evidence. They say there's one woman in the Senate, therefore. Or they say that women make X percent of the income of men without bothering to find out what percentage of those women are working part-time, what percentage of them are re-entering the labor force after 20 years of having children, etc. Rather than saying, let us compare now women who chose to stay in the labor force continuously since high school, on into their 30s, let's say, compared to men who did, and see how do they compare. And there, these great differences tend to disappear. In some cases, the women make more.
Well, but you seem substantially to have eliminated invidious explanations. For instance, when you write, how far have we come in removing discriminatory pay differences among individuals with the same qualifications and different racial or ethnic backgrounds? Among the younger generation, we have just about all the way. This is you.
Yes.
Now, this would suggest that you have satisfied yourself that there are no invidious standards that inhibit minority ethnics from...
No, you'll never reach the point where there are no invidious standards, because they will always...
They critically affect.
Oh, I'm saying that if you're trying to explain pay differences, that's not an explanation that will stand up to a closer look at the data. And that's true not only in the United States, incidentally, it's also true in other parts of the world, that if you look at, again, go back to Chinese and Malaysia. In Malaysia, the Malays are the dominant force, not only numerically, but politically. They control the government, and so on.
In fact, they have anti-Chinese laws.
Oh, they do. Yeah. So there's no question whether the Chinese are discriminating against the Malaysia. And all you have to do is read the books, the statute books, and they tell you there's no two ways about it. The fact of the matter is the Chinese make double the income of the average Malay. So the question is not whether people are discriminated against. The question is, how effective is that discrimination, and to what extent does it explain income differences? Because many of the groups that are above the average income in the United States and in other countries are groups that have demonstrably been discriminated against in various ways. The Jews would be classic. The Japanese also. And the Japanese make almost 1/3 higher income than the average American. So the question is not whether there's been this interracial friction and so on. That's existed everywhere and down through history. The question is, how much can you explain the income differences that way?
Well, assuming then that you can't explain them in terms of discrimination, then they have got to be explained in some other way. Now, what ways suggest themselves to you as subsidizing the principal residual differences?
Oh, I would think differences in skill and experience.
Or may I give these figures you give just as a background here for the audience? If the average American makes 100, Dr. Sowell points out that Jews make 170, Irish 103, West Indians 94, blacks 62, and Indians 60. Now, did you factor into that age differentials or not?
No, those were gross figures.
Those are gross figures.
Yes.
So therefore they would come together a lot more if you took out the age.
In fact, I did one set of numbers some years ago of 30-year-old males only, and there the differentials began to shrink. As you look at other things like that, the more things you hold constant, the more these numbers tend to shrink. Unfortunately, after all this time, no one has bothered that I know of to try to eliminate differences of age, differences of education, and particularly qualitative differences in education, and try to see how much is left after you've done all of that. It begins to fall away pretty rapidly, though, with some of those things.
Okay, but nevertheless, certain significant differences remain.
Major differences, and I don't want to be optimistic, because if you're poor for reason X rather than for reason Y, that is no enormous consolation. I mean, that will not impress the landlord or the people at the supermarket. The fact is, they want to know how much money do you have. And you want to know how much money you're going to get, too. So that these are major differences, and things need to be done about them. Unfortunately, politics involves telling people what they want to hear. And what people want to hear is that a certain kind of villainy can explain almost all of it. Now, there's no such thing as a lack of villainy among human beings. Anytime you take any large group of people, you have an almost inexhaustible source of sins. And if you want to look into all those sins, you can go on forever looking into them. The question is whether those sins explain the numbers you're talking about.
What would you do to help those blacks who are still in a very low economic condition in terms of education, for example? There are, as you said, many blacks today who are still being given totally inadequate education, yes, cannot be expected to get very far for that reason. What would be your remedy for that?
I know.
That's very easy. I would allow their parents to have a choice of where to send them to school, whether that choice is called a voucher scheme, open enrollment, tuition tax credit, any kind of scheme of that sort that would put that power in the hands of their parents. Mainly because that would mean that the schools would have to be responsive to them. As it is now, the school is a monopoly. They need not be responsive. I have relatives right here in New York whom I've had to intervene for because the schools would not even treat them decently, much less give them access to the information they wanted that they were entitled to under the law.
If you put it in the hands of the parents, and the parents are themselves uneducated, and not really aware of what the various potentials are, what makes you think that they would decide more intelligently than the present system?
I think, again, history. As blacks emerged from slavery, a minute percentage could read or write, and yet in half a century, over half the black population was literate. An economic historian has called that one of the most remarkable things in history. If you look back to the era prior to the Civil War, when there were free blacks, about 500,000 in the United States, they not only were not allowed in the public schools, they were in some states forbidden even to send their children to private schools and had to do so clandestinely. And yet the census of 1850 showed that most free blacks could read and write. So I don't think that the fact that people have little education means that they are in any way poorer judges than distant bureaucrats who have their own axes to grind in running the public school system.
But you yourself said that you thought one of the reasons why blacks were still in an underprivileged position, those who still are, was because they had not been given a proper education.
Yes.
And we are now talking about people who had not been given a proper education, making decisions for their children as to what is a proper education. And you're saying that if that was put up to them, they would make a wiser choice than the present efforts to integrate the schools.
Let me say that if they would not make a very different choice, it would be hard to understand the hysterical opposition of teachers' unions to giving them that opportunity.
I would like to, for a moment, ask you some questions about the economics of job getting in terms of the blacks versus the whites. The statistics I was able to pull together indicate that at the present time, white males make $17,427 on an average basis for the year. Black males make $12,738. White females make $10,244, and black females make $9,476. It is clear from these figures, as indeed I think it's clear to most of us from what we see, that there is a discrimination against blacks and against women in our present system. Since not all blacks will be superior, how would you try to even that out so that there would be some equality of job opportunities?
I'm sorry you missed the earlier part of the program when I pointed out that where you find people not represented evenly, that does not show the institutional effect, because almost nowhere in human affairs do you find people evenly represented.
Well,
if you compare comparable people with respect to age, with respect to education, etc., you get a totally different picture, both with respect to blacks and women. Now, the figures that I saw, for example, showed more recently that if you take black families where the husband and wife are both college educated and compare them to a white family where the husband and wife are both college educated, the black family is now earning $2,000 a year more. The problem is that very few blacks fall in that category. That when you compare category for category, then we're talking about getting people a decent education. I'm saying that you cannot say that numbers collected at the employer's place of business reflect simply the employer's policies. Those numbers reflect underlying conditions in the whole society, just as numbers collected at a hospital do not show you that the people are sick because they're in the hospital.
No, I would agree with that, but you would also have to agree that generally speaking, women are paid less, for example, for the same jobs as men.
No, I would not. I would not agree with that. If you're talking about women with the same number of years of experience, with the same continuous service, et cetera, then when I look at that, I don't find that disparity. I find, for example, in many cases, the women are making more, depending on how you break the data down. The difference with women is between married women and everybody else. That's the real difference.
Well, even as to single women, the Census Bureau statistics, the most recent ones I could find, 1978, say that single men are earning $11,100 and single women are earning $9,300.
Yes, I love the word single that is used. When I did my study, I didn't use single, I used never married. You see, a woman who is single at age 40, having spent 10 or 20 years raising children, is really not quite the same as a man of age 40 who's been working continuously for 20 years.
And the differential she cited is not that great, so it could easily be accounted for by the point
Yes,
you
because when I
raised.
break them down the other way, I did this for the academic world, and there I found the women who are never married, which is the term the way I take it. There they were earning more than the men. And similarly, when the government did data some years ago on women who had been working continuously since high school into their 30s, there you found that they were making slightly more than men of the same description. So the difference is between married women and everybody else. And married men get an extra bonus because their wives take care of many things that enable them to put more time into their careers.
I'm sure you're aware of the fact that there are approximately 15% of all homes in which there is only one wage earner. So that when you talk about women being able to take care of things for their married mate wage earner, the fact is that in the overwhelming majority of American homes, the women also work. And therefore, I don't think your explanation that women have other responsibilities and that that's why they are...
Work can mean part-time work or full-time work. Women do not work full-time to the same extent that men. Part-time workers make less than full-time workers.
Would it be your feeling that if all the affirmative action programs were discontinued, women and minorities would go ahead much faster than they have under the affirmative action programs?
Yes, it's not my opinion. The data indicate that, for example, Puerto Ricans had a higher percentage of the national average income before quotas than after. So did Mexican Americans. Blacks have about the same. So there's a marvelous putting of the burden on other people. You're saying here's this massive program that has existed now for a decade,
That's
and you're unable to show me the benefits that have come from all this enormous controversy.
Well, it certainly has been a revolution insofar as women's participation in the labor force.
Not
and
really,
in the
not
professions
really.
that's concerned.
No, it hasn't. No,
Well,
it hasn't.
I know that of my own knowledge.
No, you don't know it of your own knowledge because I've also looked at the same thing. And in the past, you found women overrepresented in many professional occupations, much more so than today, and you find that decline in those occupations much more highly correlated with a lower age of marriage for college women and with more childbearing. And as those two demographic factors have changed, women have also changed in their representation. So there's this whole myth that's been created that this is all a function of political developments of the past decade or so, just will not stand up.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Pilpel.